Okay, so we're in section 3.2. We're talking about influential figures and perspectives. We are still in the history piece of the puzzle. In this particular section, we're going to talk about influential figures in the history of cognitive psychology and some important perspectives. Okay, so the outcomes for this video include to talk about these influential figures and their contribution to the field, some of which actually founded some perspectives, and we'll talk about those. So we'll start with structuralism, where we'll talk about Wilhelm Wundt and his student Edward Tishner. Then we'll talk about some beautiful memory research conducted by Hermann von Ebbinghaus. Next, we'll talk about William James and his perspective called functionalism. Then we'll move on to behaviorism, um, founded by Watson and popularized by Skinner. And we'll start with structuralism in the next line. Okay, so we'll talk about Wilhelm Wundt, and the first field of psychology ever conceptualized in the scientific era was structuralism, and that's what we'll talk about. Um, William Wundt was a German physician, a German researcher, and you can see here he's William Wundt. And in 1879, he established the first psychological laboratory in Leipzig, Germany. And doing so, he established psychology as its own field. And if you think about the origins of psychology emerging as a scientific field, that can be pointed to this particular instance where a psychological laboratory was established in Germany. And the credit goes to um, William Wundt for that. And for that reason, 1879 is considered as the birth year of psychology in general. And William Wundt is considered as the father of psychology. So, um, what was the topic he was interested in? Well, he was interested in conscious mind, um, where he would ask participants to look at an object and describe the features of the object. For example, if a participant is shown an object like an apple, and they were asked to describe the object without actually naming the object. So they can't say it's an apple. They are supposed to describe its feature, like it's round, shiny, red, and things like those. The idea was that this conscious experience of viewing the apple, in his words, or according to his perspective, um, involves some components of the object that we are experiencing. By getting to these components of the experience, he proposed that we be able to understand how our mind works. So the topic was to study the immediate experience, and then figure out how we know how we combine these things. In other words, he was interested in the atomic structural components of our conscious experience. That's why it has the name structuralism to it. And because participants were asked to look into their own experience and report their thoughts, this methodology is called introspection. And the assumption of this particular methodology was that by knowing the structure of our conscious mind, we can know how our mind works. And this kind of ties back to the bigger picture we looked at, and we said that structuralism is the first field or perspective, and the point of interest or the topic of interest was mind. Although the methodology Wundt used was introspection, which was considered subjective, and people um, um, moved away from structuralism because of this idea of measuring something that you can't see, number one. Number two, something measuring something so subjectively that it will be different from person to person. Okay, so Edward Titchener is the second influential figure we're going to talk about, who is also related to structuralism. In fact, Titchener was one of the first few students of Wundt. Um, and the other student was Stanley, and who came back to Stanley came back to the U.S. and he established APA, American Psychological Association. He was the first president of American Psychological Association. He did several other things. Edward Titchener, what he did is he popularized the work. He spread the work of William Wundt, which was primarily in German. And people in countries like UK and, and US that didn't speak English had no idea. So he basically spread his work to English speaking nations. And that's Edward Titchener's most prominent contribution. Also, it is said that William Wundt student Titchener is a person who actually coined the term structuralism. Hermann von Ebbinghaus was born in 1850 in Prussia, Germany, and he died in 1909. Um, he was a German psychologist, and he's well known for his experimental methods, specifically to study human memory. And most of the experimental methods he had developed then were beyond the time then. He kind of gave an idea that mental processes like memory can and such higher mental faculties can be actually studied and objectively. And he's known for creating, and this is in like late 1800s, right, like 1860, 70, 80. In 70s, I think that's when he received his PhD, and afterwards he has done some wonderful work, including his well-known work on CVC, which is consonant vowel consonants. So zeg, tex, said. So these are nonsense three consonant vowel consonant trigrams. And these are called nonsense syllables in the sense that they don't make any sense. And he seemed to have created over 2,000, well over 2,000 such nonsense syllables. And he also developed this idea of saving score. And he also developed the idea of forgetting curve. So let's talk about each of these constructs. First, we'll talk about the idea of saving score. Then we'll talk about forgetting curve. So the beauty of these experiments, his experiments, was that he was the researcher, of course, and he was also the participant. And to remove the confound of him knowing the material that he was creating, he actually created a nonsense syllables, three-letter trigrams. The first letter is a consonant, the second letter is a vowel, and the third letter is a consonant, and the combination doesn't make any sense. That's why nonsense syllables. And in a single syllable trigrams, right? Then what he would do is um, he would take a list of such words, okay? And we're talking about saving scores construct here. So he would take a list of such words, say 100 words or what, how many ever words he would select. Then he would read. Reading here is not just a reading in any way he could, but he would adapt a method where he would repeat these words at a specific rate, go through the entire list of nonsense syllables once, same rate, second, third, fourth, and he would recite it as long as he would take to actually recall them 100% accurately. Beautiful, right? And he would then make a note of how many recitals he needed, to how many times he needed to rehearse this this list of syllables to learn them first time. Then he would stay away from the materials for a while. And at different times, on different occasion, at different times, like immediately he would relearn, or after a few hours he would relearn, or after a day or a week, and so on and so forth. Then what he would measure is the number of attempts he would need to relearn the material. Now it makes sense, right? First time you may need like 110 recitals, for instance. Second time you may not need 10 recitals. Maybe 6 recitals is sufficient. So the idea is that he would see how many fewer items, how many fewer attempts he would need to relearn the same material, and he would define that as the savings score. Let's say you need 20 attempts to learn a list of nonsense syllabus the first time. And let's say you only need 5 attempts the second time. The saving scores would then be how many fewer recitals do you need for the second time? Well, 20 minus 5, 15, right? And this is 15 out of 20, which is 75%. So the saving scores for learning this material would be 75%. So the idea is saving score is this construct of how much information is retained from first learning to the second learning. So this meticulous method of studying human memory was so popular, and it is well known, and that laid foundation to experimental psychology, right? Remember, this was before psychology was born as a field by itself. Remember, 1879 is considered as the year, although there were other work that was going on, including his work. We Psychology was not recognized as a scientific field till 1879, but Ebbinghaus started working on it even before that, and his work would prove to be very influential eventually, even for the emergence of cognitive psychology. Okay, in the next slide, we'll talk about the forgetting curve. Okay, to talk about Ebbinghaus's work, let's move on to forgetting curve. Now, just to give you an idea, it is the same experimental paradigm that we discussed in the last slide when we were talking about the saving scores idea, where he would take a list of words, main syllables, nonsense syllables, then learn them by repeating them at a specific rate till he would actually recall 100% accurately. Then he would stay away from that material for a while, then try to relearn and see how many relearnings he would need, and then he would compute the saving score. Where along those lines, what he did was, for some lists, he would, or for sometimes for some lists, he would recall immediately. For others, after say half an hour, or after an hour, or after a day, or after 2 days, or 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, and so on and so forth. So the second learning time, the delay in second learning, would be the IV. You can see it's computed like in 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, 24 hours, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, and so on and so forth. That's the x-axis. Y-axis, interestingly, is the saving score, which is how much of information is retained from the first to the second learning. If the second learning was immediately after learning the first time, right, without any delay, then the saving score was 100%. In other words, participant didn't need to learn the material. They would actually he would actually recall the material 100% accurately. But as the delay between the first learning and second learning increased, you can see there was a steep curve. The saving scores dropped. 100% to like nearly 60% in 20 minutes. Participant or he was only able to retain 58% of the information. The saving scores was only 58% after 20 minutes. After an hour, it would go down to baseline, like 50%, like 45 or 50%. In a day, the saving scores would go down to 33%. And in 6 days, the information would be only 25%. In other words, the amount of information that one could remember or retain in rote rehearsal, these are all rote rehearsals, right? Because they're meaningless information and just rehearsing the information. So in these contexts, most of the information is lost in few hours. That's why there's a steep curve down, right? Where the saving score drops initially in few hours, and in the first day most of the information is lost. By first day, you can see that, right? 75% of information is lost, only 33% is retained, and that is called forgetting curve. Forgetting curve tells us how much of something do we forget each day. Well, a lot is forgotten the very first day. So, and Ebbinghaus is known for this beautiful work, and we'll study in other uh, um um, sections of the history how this idea was so helpful to lay foundation to this proposition that we can study um, mental processes even if we can't see them. And they can be studied objectively because this methodology was so objective and pioneering. And because of his beautiful work, Ebbinghaus is often considered as the father of memory research. Well, let's move on to the next influential figure in the next slide. Now, think of functionalism as another perspective. And in the last slide, we talked about um, memory research. That was not a perspective, it was a pure experimental paradigm and to study human memory. There wasn't any perspective attached to it. That was independent work. Ebbinghaus did not found any perspective or any specific field of psychology. Unlike Wundt, who established the first psychological laboratory, right, and laid foundation to a way, to a field called structuralism. And we know the specific methodologies, assumptions of it. We'd already talked about it. And if you recall, the structuralism was established in Europe, right, Germany. Functionalism, on the other hand, was American in the sense that it was established by William James, an American physician, and he was interested. He was a doctor, so he was interested in helping patients. And there was a time when people started finding alternative perspectives, alternative ways to think about psychology, alternative to the structuralism, because primarily, number one, they thought, well, introspection is not subjective, it's not objective, it's a subjective method, and it doesn't make sense to study something that you can't see. Now, one of the alternatives was William James's idea of functionalism, where you can see even the name is strikingly uh, um, so different and opposite to the structuralism. Functionalism. Structuralism studies the structure of conscious experience. Functionalism, on the other hand, is about the importance or the functions, is a study about the functions of human faculty, so, or mental faculty. The idea is this: William James was a physician who was more interested in helping people, patients, and he was influenced by Darwin idea, um, Darwin's idea that you can, what do you say? I'm going to pause here for a second. So, if you think about Darwin and his idea of evolution, um, so the idea is that the that we humans are evolved from other living organisms. and the characteristics that humans have, both physical and psychological, have some evolutionary importance to it. Um, and the assumption then is that knowing the functions of these features for the purpose of survival is more important than studying the structure of the conscious experience. And that's what William James, thought should be studied in the field of psychology. He was more interested in knowing how our mind adapts to the changing circumstances, as opposed to studying the structure of the human mind. Um, and that's why this particular perspective is called functionalism. So where he's interested in knowing the functions of the features, and for his work he is considered as the father of American psychology. um, it's one of the first psychological perspectives in the America, in the United States, that was developed, and then that was developed by William James. Okay. And in the next section, we'll talk about the other perspective, another perspective. Okay, so this brings us to the next perspective, which is also American, and this was proposed. This perspective is called behaviorism, and this was founded by um, J.B. Watson. Um, Now, behaviorism, just like functionalism, came as an alternative to structuralism. So, and in doing so, the one of the important characteristic of this alternative fields was to to strikingly differ from the original structuralist perspective, uh, of which the important thing was the study of mental processes as not important, and or the idea of studying something that you can't see as a non-scientific proposition. So these two were very well taken care of. These two issues of structuralism were very well dealt with by Watson's behaviorism. He was influenced by Pavlov's. Remember the Pavlov's classical conditioning, right? The dog, Bill. Um, So the neutral stimulus will become a conditioned stimulus if they are paired together. Okay, so he developed several experiments based on classical conditioning and started describing learning via classical conditioning. And this classical conditioning idea purely relies on studying only observable behaviors, right? So behaviorism then is an extreme version of non-structuralism or non-mental processes, in the sense that it only studies what you can see. So the methodology would be an objective observation. It was an alternative to structuralism. The entire field was in that mood at that time, and behaviorism gave a beautiful perspective, a beautiful alternative to structuralism, because behaviorism provided some learning theories that were so well demonstrable and useful. Number two, um, behaviorists like Watson imagine psychology as a field similar to physics, which was more objective in measuring stuff. So people were trying to emulate the success story of such hard science like physics, and behaviorism was actually providing that opportunity, because it said that you can only study what you can see and adopt stringent, objective methodology of observation. So the idea of Watson was to convert psychology into a science of external behavior in that sense, and for that reason, because he founded it, he's considered as the father of behaviorism. And the birth year, you can say, is 1913, because that's the year he wrote an article which is often considered as the um, uh, so often considered as the behavioristic manifesto, like um, the rules of the field of behaviorism. Now, in the next slide, we'll talk about another influential figure, but related to the same field of behaviorism. If Watson founded behaviorism, then this person, Skinner, he popularized behaviorism. I'll talk about this person in the next slide. So, behaviorism was popularized by this person, B.F. Skinner, and he's known for his um, Skinner box, where he would actually develop learning principles, um, and it was influenced by operant conditioning. And this explanation of learning as a function, as a function of rewards and punishment became so popular that it had even influenced policymakers, education. That the idea is that you can change the behavior of an organism by changing the environment. If you reward a behavior, it gets reinforced. If you punish a behavior, then it is lost. So you can shape the behavior by shaping the environment. That was the idea. Again, it's behaviorism because you are only measuring, observing, and changing behavior, and the learning theories that were developed were so popular because they were successful. And so there was educational paradigms and programs developed to actually reinforce kids, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, or punishment. Things like those become very, very popular. At some point, Skinner said, "Give me some individuals, I'll turn them to be whatever we want." And he was so popular in explaining learning principles or training animals that he said he asked for some pigeons so he can train them to carry missiles during World War II. So that's how popular behaviorism was in 50s, and we're talking about 1950s here. Um, then in 1957, yeah, 1957, um, what Skinner does is he writes a book, and we'll talk about that in the next section. Um, and the book's name is Verbal Behavior. So then he does this thing in this book where he tries to explain language acquisition, the way how kids learn language, um, in so simple terms of reinforcement and punishment that it upset someone. That someone was Chomsky, a linguist. And that his response is an important historic event in itself, because that laid foundation to the next perspective, the cognitive psychology perspective. So that's for later, though. So we're just talking about some influential figures, and this is B.F. Skinner. So then it led to the emergence of cognitive psychology. One important event, and we'll talk about several other events that led from people to go from behaviorism to cognitive psychology, but one of the events is related um, to that book of 1957 book written by Skinner. And to that book, Chomsky wrote a response, a review of that book in 1959, and his response to that book, his review of that book, which was released in that review was released in 1959, that became popular and known as the Cognitive Manifesto. And cognitive psychology was born. The birth year of cognitive psychology is assumed to be 1960, and that's not the only event that led to the birth of cognitive psychology. People were also studying other methodologies, other things other than behaviorism, although behaviorism was very popular at that time. And we'll talk about all that in the next section. So this led to cognitive psychology, there is no one influential figure. There are several people, and there are several movements. There are several things that happened that led to cognitive psychology, and we'll talk about those influential figures specific to cognitive psychology in the next section. But just to give you an idea of, we went from structuralism to behaviorism. There were other perspectives like functionalism and so on and so forth. There in Germany there were other perspectives like Gestalt and so on and so forth. But there were also independent researchers like Ebbinghaus, Bartlett, and who not. Um, and that all led to the birth of cognitive psychology, which studies mental processes like structuralism and adopts um, um, strict observation as the methodology to study mental processes. So, so in the next slide, we'll talk about what makes cognitive psychology different from other perspective, and that is the current perspective, cognitive psychology, and that's why you're taking this class. So we'll talk about those basic assumptions in the next slide. Okay, so cognitive psychology and the basic assumptions. If you remember, we said that um, the main fight was about what to study and how to study. And all the perspectives basically differed in this idea of what should be studied and how it should be studied. Cognitive psychology studies both external and internal information, mental processes, which is internal behavior, and external behavior that you can observe. And it uses objective methods of studying it. So in doing so, there should be a way to reconcile and say, well, how can you study objectively something that you can't see? Well, we'll talk about that later in the unit when we talk about methodologies. But now I'm going to just give you an idea that cognitive psychology assumes that they are real mental processes, and it also assumes that mental processes can be objectively studied. In fact, it states that we humans are informivores, carnivores, herbivores, and informivores. Herbivores eat plants, carnivores eat animals. Herbivores, right? Carnivores, omnivores eat everything. Informivores eat information. Not only exaggeration or analogy, but the idea is that we are information processing systems. IPS. We seek information and we process information. Humans are information processing system. So these are the three main assumptions. These assumptions are so fundamental that these are called meta theory. And these are the assumptions that are never questioned. And we assume these things and then we build theories based on these assumptions. Okay, so in the next section, we'll talk about slight changes to the original perspective. The original methodology that cognitive psychology adapted is called IPS, Information Processing System. We made some slight changes to that. Again, we'll talk about the slight changes in the next unit when we talk about methodology. But for now, I'm going to quickly talk about what other perspectives are there in cognitive psychology in the next slide. Okay, so the initial perspective in 1960 when cognitive psychology was born is considered as the IP perspective, and which has these three basic assumptions we looked at. But it has more than that. And we'll talk about what it means to be more than that later. But now, just keeping in mind that a strict information processing approach was only popular till 1970s. After 1970, it was revised. We still assume even now that mental processes exist and we can study them and we're information processing systems, but there were some slight revisions. We'll talk about it in a later unit, what these revisions are. But that led to a more diverse, more multidisciplinary approach called cognitive science approach. So cognitive psychology now uses this approach called cognitive science approach, which is multidisciplinary. We study different methodologies using reaction time, accuracy, and whatnot. In addition to one more addition to this is neuroscience. We also take methodology of neuroscience, all leading to help us understand how our mental process or mind work. There is another alternative perspective. alternative to information processing perspective called connectionist approach. And then we don't study or touch this topic as much in this class, um, but maybe you take another class on that topic. Um, so that is cognitive psychology. Well, that brings us to the end of this unit section. We'll move on to the next section in this unit, 3.3. Thank you.